The second part of the morning is around a piece of research which is being launched today. It goes live today on our site. It's also going to be distributed. The executive summary, copies of the executive summary are going to be distributed to you now by my colleagues Brendan and Audrey. I just want to tell you a little story about this. I wasn't supposed to be up here stealing someone else's thunder. Caroline Fahey was supposed to be up here, having worked tirelessly, having project managed this piece of research into the lives of one-parent families. Caroline commissioned work by OCS Consulting, who did the field work. But Caroline very meticulously wrote up the results, integrated them with policy recommendations, both for government, but also learning for ourselves as a charity, as a service deliverer, as an organisation who works with one-parent families. Caroline can't be here today. We heard on Friday that Caroline was in hospital and may have had her child on Friday or indeed Saturday. We wait with bated breath. So we have our fingers crossed and we send all our best wishes to Caroline. So indeed, I feel a bit of a fraud and a phony by even standing up here and pretending that I am the kind of knowledge on this piece of research that Caroline clearly is, because she listened to interviews, she recorded transcripts, she wrote and rewrote sections of the piece of work. She lived and breathed this piece of work. So all that I can do and my colleague Liz Kerins can do is honour as best we can Caroline's work. So we might just start off with the presentation. So in your mind, if you can make some kind of intellectual or cognitive break between the ethics initiative and the launch of this piece of research, because quite frankly, it's far too early for another coffee break, let's face it. So we might start off with the presentation in relation to the piece of research called "It's the Hardest Job in the World." Phew. Okay, so that's part of the cover of the piece of research. It's been over 2 years in the making. These inquiries, these pieces of research take usually longer than you think, and they take a very long time because you're trying to reach quite a difficult to reach group of people, and you're trying to do it ethically, there's that word again, and you're trying to do it in a way which is humane, which respects the circumstances of the individual, and we're trying to conduct the research through our network of volunteer members. So that was a quote from one of the parents of one of the one-parent families that were interviewed. Now, why this research? Why now? Why one-parent families? One-parent families are the largest group requesting assistance and support from the Society of St Vincent de Paul. The vast majority of those who request assistance and who we assist are families with children, but within that, the single largest household type are one-parent families. In order to arrive at a better understanding of the needs and the circumstances of one-parent families being assisted by the Society, we commissioned OCS Consulting to help us with the research, with the field work, to research into both heads of one-parent families being helped by SVP and also SVP members involved in home visitation work. We also had a research advisory group, and many of the research advisory group are present here, and I thank you all for your time and your insights at the Research Advisory Group. So, the facts as opposed to the myths. There are over 215,000 one-parent families living in Ireland. That's 1 in 4, a quarter of all families in the Republic of Ireland. 30,000 of these families are headed by a father parenting alone. So 1 in 7 of all one-parent families are indeed parented by a father. 6/7, the vast majority, parented by a mother, parenting alone. Just under 80,000 are in receipt of a thing called the one-parent family payment, and many of you in your conference work will know about that. And also it's important to remember that over 40% of lone parents work. They're not a homogenous group. You cannot make generalizations. And just under 60% have only one child. Yet, in terms of poverty and deprivation, one-parent families experience sustained and persistent levels of poverty. About 1 in 6 experience a thing called consistent poverty, where you're under a minimum level of income, and you also report deprivation of a number of key items. And almost a third were at risk of poverty. Half experienced or reported to experience deprivation. They've also been the group that have experienced the greatest cuts in relation to recent budgets, in relation to changes to eligibility levels with regard to the one-parent family payment. And indeed, one parent with one child in social welfare has lost the biggest percentage of income of any household type, even a couple on €200,000. So, indeed, the statistics set out the context in which SVP members operate, conference members operate. But remember, people are parenting alone for a whole host of reasons. 40% of lone fathers are widowed compared to 20% of lone mothers. Over 40% of lone mothers are single women, and almost a third are divorced or separated. And obviously, access to public services are very, very important. 30% of those in need of social housing are one-parent families. So there are particular needs, particular vulnerabilities with regard to one-parent households. So going back to the title of the research, the experience of the society working with one-parent families is indeed that those parents are doing the hardest job. Not only are they raising their children on their own, they're also trying to do that on a low and limited income. So it's a big challenge to do both, an extremely difficult challenge. And many of them are doing that in the context of also working and juggling all sorts of responsibilities. As I say, they're not the one single group. They're a very diverse group. But there is a high level of social exclusion and poverty experienced by that group. And what came through in the research, and this is borne out by the experience of many of you in your conference work, is that poverty, low incomes, and lack of access or struggling to access certain services, for example, healthcare, childcare, housing that I mentioned, or indeed poor quality housing in, for example, the private rented sector. Educational disadvantage, maybe as a parent having experienced educational disadvantage, or children not having had sufficient, say, preschool education, facing barriers in school, has very, very poor outcomes for a number of families, whatever their structure. But we're looking, obviously, this morning at one-parent families. So, as President Higgins said, we have been established, among other things, to identify the root causes of poverty, to tackle poverty based on evidence and based on advocacy. And that's exactly what we're trying to do with regard to the research. So just a really quick overview of of how we did it. There were 61 interviews across 6 of the old regions. This is where it kind of it gets a bit confusing. It's 6 of the old regions out of 12 in the Republic. So those regions were Dublin, Cork, Kerry, West, South East, and Midwest. And clearly we're in a state of transition, so those regions don't necessarily exist in their current form now. 6 focus groups with SVP members. So remember, this piece of research was both with the heads of one-parent families, but also with SVP members themselves. So both from the perspective of an adult in a household, in a family, and also with regard to that experience, that conference experience, that member experience. Now, at this point, I'm going to hand over to Liz, who's going to give us some of the results. Now, Liz is taking over from Caroline as Caroline embarks on her maternity leave. Today was to be the last day of Caroline's work before she embarked on maternity leave, but she has bigger fish to fry. So actually, I want to officially introduce to you Liz Cairns, who will be taking over for Caroline on maternity leave. So, Liz.
Thanks, John Mark, and hello, everybody. Okay. So, what did the one-parent families in the research tell SVP? Well, here's a quotation from one of those people that have been assisted by SVP. She said, "Things that cause me stress and worry, the things that would keep me awake at night, are worrying about feeding the kids and clothing them." So that's a pretty extreme statement to make. And why was that woman making that kind of statement? So the experiences that were had by the lone parents in this research really related to inadequate income. It came down to just not enough money. It's at the heart of the problem that is being experienced by the lone parents that SVP members are currently assisting. So this is in spite of their best efforts at budgeting. It's hard to stretch what doesn't exist. Okay? So they describe themselves as, to quote from the report, experts in the arts of budgeting. So if you ever want to know about budgeting, you should probably ask some of the lone parents that are currently being assisted by SVP. Some did use the Money Advice and Budgeting Service, that is a government service, so they are making contact with some of those government services. But again, it's that issue, how to stretch what doesn't exist. So they prioritised those basic needs, really. They prioritised food for themselves and their children. They prioritised their accommodation, so paying their rents, trying to pay their mortgage, whatever. And they also prioritised their energy needs. So it's the oil tank, the gas, the electricity, etc. And as you know, as members, energy costs are one of the areas where SVP pays out quite a lot of its money in assistance. So their standard of living was pretty basic. So some of the things, what did they go without then? Some of the things that were forgone were kind of interesting, the things that they brought up. Very basic things like clothing and shoes, sport and extracurricular activities for their children, home repairs, haircuts, things that we all kind of take for granted. Tea towels came up, very, very simple things. Needing new tea towels could send your budget off in any week. Light bulbs, obviously family celebrations, and Christmas. And Christmas was something that, it's an event that they start dreading very early in the year. It was something that a lot of them brought up Christmas as a big pressure point. And just to say that there are, John Mark already mentioned the fact that, that there are indicators of deprivation that the government used to decide who is actually deprived. And most of those areas do not come into those deprivation indicators. The point being that deprivation is obviously wider than how we measure it in Ireland. So they were going without, the constant vigilance on expenditure, so that's a stress and a pressure, but they prioritised their children's needs. The children came first. They had the first draw on the income before the parents. The other thing was that the lone parents found themselves getting into debt. And really the issue there is a lack of access to affordable credit. These were not people that could approach the bank, not that many of us can approach the bank at the moment anyway, but they really couldn't approach the bank and haven't been able to do that for a long, long time. They also had arrears in terms of bills. So they were constantly, every week's, every month's lone parent payment, they had to keep kind of taking extra money out of that to pay for their arrears. And unfortunately, they did, in some cases, resort to both legal and illegal money lenders, but with very, very high interest rates. And small expenses would send the budget plan off. Small additional expenses might be something like a child's birthday party, their own children, or the issue of trying to send their children to other children's birthday parties, which is, as you know, is so important in children's lives. So I won't go into this too much, but John Mark has already mentioned, why is this? Why are we seeing this situation now? Why is SVP currently assisting so many lone parent families? And really comes down to the successive budgets since 2008, I guess, which are having a cumulative impact on lone parent families. Another issue that has come up is that on the one-parent family payment, lone parents can work on a part-time basis. And that was very, very helpful for parents who are parenting alone, because obviously if you're parenting alone, you can sometimes be a mother and a father to a child or to children. But what has happened is that the earnings disregard has decreased. So basically, their income has decreased. Lone parents who are in part-time employment find that their income has decreased. So that's a big issue. Additional charges, the $250 that has been placed on prescriptions for lone parents, for anybody on a medical card, that came up frequently, and without being asked, lone parents talked about this. It sounds like a little, $250, but if you have 3 or 4 prescriptions in a month, 5 prescriptions, 6 prescriptions, you're going to multiply all that by $250. A quarter of participants had difficulties paying this. Rent supplement. Many of the lone parents were reliant on the private rented sector. They couldn't get into local authority accommodation, although some of them were in local authority accommodation. And trying to find a landlord to take the rent supplement was an issue. But second of all, the income limits that are set by our health boards are not sufficient to meet the actual rents that are out there, the market rents that are out there. So the consequences for these lone parents: food poverty. And this was a very, very central experience in this research. Parent strategies. Parents don't just decide, well, okay, that's it, we have no food. They adopt a strategy. They're proactive about it. They're careful when they shop. They do things like, maybe some lone parents bought food in installments, so that by the end of the week you would know you'd have still some food. Others bought it at the beginning of the month and tried to ration it out for that month until they got some extra money. Parents skipped meals. Again, this is the issue of them prioritising their children's needs. And for some, and this is quite a striking statement in the research, I think, that there was an assumption of hunger at some stage in the week. That's a very striking statement. Fuel poverty, big area for assistance, as we've already said by SVP. Keeping warm was a struggle. Partly to do not just with the affordability of the fuel, but to do with the kind of condition of the accommodation they're living in. So damp accommodation with poor windows, that kind of thing. You can, as you know, you can keep heating that, but really you're heating the outside of the house rather than the inside. Then the other issue was education costs for children and children's participation and disadvantage. Again, parents prioritised in terms of their money that they got from their one-parent family payment, their employment, whatever their maintenance. They prioritised children's educational costs. So it's the bus fares, it's buying the school books. Not every lone parent had the advantage of a school book rental scheme, so that was an issue. So some of the influences, some of the impacts, you can read that there. Relationships. Again, something very, very striking from the research. The extent of the loneliness and isolation experienced by these lone parents was a recurring theme in the research. They relied on their family for practical and emotional support. So practical support could be something like help with childcare. You're trying to juggle work, trying to juggle part-time work, trying to juggle your life. Help with childcare. Borrowing money from family was also very common. And that obviously that might be in some ways seen as positive. The negative side was that if you borrow money from your family, as we all know, and if you don't pay your money back, it's very hard to go back to see them again. It's very hard to go back on a Sunday for Sunday dinner or whatever. So you find these parents were finding themselves isolated from their families in those particular cases. Most of them still had some form of relationship with the other parent. And it was valued, but most of these parents were in legal actions with the other parent. So that was another stress on their lives. Parenting without support of a partner arose again in the research. The whole issue of trying to discipline children, not having someone to share decision-making with was seen as being a problem. So here's I think John Mark mentioned myths, a bit of myth-busting here. Most of the lone parents here wanted to get into employment and get into education and training. High levels of motivation in the research. But barriers. Older lone parents felt that getting back into the education sector or into the workforce, they were too old. There was a strong desire to take up part-time work. However, part-time quality work is an issue. Barriers include poverty and employment traps, the recent reforms John Mark already mentioned, caring responsibilities. Lone parents might be single earners, but they're not single people. The costs of taking up education and training, because there have been more cutbacks, government cutbacks in that area, and the lack of suitable local opportunities. So that particularly occurred in maybe some of the more rural areas. So mental health and well-being. Living a life on a low income is a strain. Worry, anxiety, and going without. A lot of these lone parents were also experiencing relationship breakdowns, family illness, bereavement, and all of this compounded the strain for these people. Positive aspects of parenthood were valued, so these lone parents took great pride in their children's achievements and their experiences. And the future, President Higgins mentioned the future and ambitions. So this lone parent is talking about it's very difficult to be optimistic about the future when you're constantly battling on a day-to-day and a week-to-week and a month-to-month basis with low income. In a way, it's a type of social exclusion, to be excluded from future ambitions. They had limited control over many aspects of their lives, so where they lived, what work they could do. I think it's another very important point from the research is that for those lone parents that had access to education and training, they were more likely to feel a bit more hopeful about the future and could see a future for themselves and could see a future for their children. And they could envisage life improving. But of course, there was a lot to do. Quite a few of them were trying to improve their relationships with their own families, relationships with the fathers or the mothers of their children. Also a strong commitment to tackling debt, household debt, dealing with the stress, and also in overcoming addiction. And I'll hand you back to John Mark now to finish up the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, really briefly, because I'm conscious it's very warm in here, it's very close, and we're keeping you longer than we promised we would. But a really powerful quote, I think, is, I didn't think this was in my future. I never thought I would be looking for help from Vincent de Paul. But things didn't work the way we planned. We broke up. I couldn't work anymore. I was looking after the kids. Your savings run out. Gives you a sense of the kind of desperation, the sense of plans gone a completely different way than you imagine, or plans happening when you're, life happening when you're busy making other plans or whatever. Okay, so being helped by the society, very briefly, and we're going to spend a bit more time over the coming months with society members in relation to some of the learning, but obviously in terms of the research, the researchers themselves were independent, but clearly those who were feeding into the research are themselves being assisted by the society, so that may or may not colour how you couch or how you approach what you say in relation to the society. That said, big issues for them were the fact that they had budgeted. Many were great budgeters, excellent budgeters, because they'd so little anyway in terms of income. They cut back, they had no more resources. That's why often when they came to the society, it was at the very, very last leg. We were the last option, and it became then essentially an emergency issue. Often, at first contact, people felt it was very, very difficult to come to the society. Why? Maybe a sense of failure. And also that sense of, do I really need to rely on a charity for myself and my children to get through? But also the positive, a chance to tell their story, especially to another adult who is sensitive, in many cases often reassuring. And also, in many cases, members focused on the well-being of the parent as well as the children. Other aspects which we probably need to reflect on, trying to understand the position of someone who has to rely on charity for help is one, the stigma attached to that. Feelings of embarrassment, failure, distress, worried about asking for specific help and maybe feeling that might not be forthcoming, feeling they're asking for too much, fear that neighbours know that SVP is calling to their house, worried about kind of maybe delays. There's often a delay between an initial call for assistance and or perceived or a real delay between that and assistance being given. And that balance, SVP is not a 24-hour emergency service, and yet the expectation of many is that the society can assist at the very, very quickly. And yet we are a network, a complex network, mostly of volunteer members. So people had to often retell stories to certain members. Maybe it was a different member visiting the house the week before and a new member. So that embarrassment about having to retell very personal family or circumstantial background. And sometimes members rushed during visits because in certain areas there's a small number of members, a huge level of need. So that's just a taster. In terms of just the recommendations, these are set out in the report that's gone live, so I'm not going to spend too much time on them. Suffice to say, they centre on improving outcomes for families in poverty. For example, encouraging extracurricular activity for children, integration with local clubs, building on that self-sufficiency, and ensuring access to public services, whether it's through childcare, when we're advocating in the public domain, improvements in the likes of the family income supplement. And we noticed last week in the news, Joan Burton mentioned the prospect in the next budget of a €30 per child per week payment for parents returning to work. That's, I guess, the kind of measure that we would be looking for in terms of easing that transition from welfare to work, helping people retain work, stay in work, and make that self-sustaining. We want people in work, education and training. We want that to be done as easily as possible. I'm conscious that you've heard a lot here this morning in relation to both the ethics and the more abstract, and on the other hand, a very, very practical exploration of the lived experience, of the lives, of the struggles, and indeed the resilience. I think it's important to emphasise that, the resilience of many people who are assisted by the Society, because this was a study into one-parent families who are assisted through conference work. So I'm just conscious to bring this to an end, bearing in mind that all the detail is online today on our website. And I'm going to hand over to our National President, Jeff Marr.